Quiet on the set.
Quiet.
M1 Deep Dive, take 2. Hey Apple fans, Apple Sheep, and everyone else watching. I am so excited about this video. Hey, don't you dare touch that dial or back button or whatever. Don't you dare leave. You do not want to miss this. Richard here with iTalk, and this is an M1 Deep Dive, and it's coming up right after the intro.
This is iTalk.
In our last video, we looked at some predictions of the next generation of Apple Silicon. In this video, we look at M1 in depth. I've done the research, so you don't have to. So, without further ado, let's get started right now. Let's talk architecture first. The M1 is built on a 5nm process, the first ever on a personal computer. It has 4 Firestorm performance cores on what's dubbed the P cluster. There are 4 Ice Storm efficiency cores on what's called the E cluster. The P cluster has 192 kilobytes L1 instruction cache, 128 kilobytes L1 data cache, and 12 megabytes shared L2 cache. It cycles at clock speeds ranging from 0.6 to 3.204 gigahertz with a maximum power consumption of 13.8 watts. The E cluster has 128 kilobytes L1 instruction cache, 64 kilobytes L1 data cache, and 4 megabytes L2 shared cache. It cycles at clock speeds ranging from 0.6 to 2.064 gigahertz with a max power consumption of only 1.3 watts. 1.3 little watts. And the E cluster efficiency cores use 1/10 the power of the P cluster performance cores. I mean, wow! And even the P clusters only use a max of 13.8 watts. This is a 100-watt light bulb. All it does is shine light. And it's 100 watts. It's like 8 times more power usage than a laptop that can run and edit on Final Cut Pro, on Lightroom, on whatever program you want to use. 13.8 watts. I just can't even, I'm just speechless. Finally, there's a fabric cache that serves essentially as an L3 cache for all of the cores. Apple hasn't released its capacity, and why this is such a big secret is really anyone's guess. So now let's talk RAM, or what Apple is calling integrated memory. This memory is 4266 megatransfers per second LPDDR4X SD RAM in a unified configuration shared by all components of the processor. More on why that's so important later. Hint: speed, baby speed. It's mounted together with the SoC in a system in a package design in 8 and 16 gigabyte configurations. The GPU is 8-core except in the entry-level MacBook Air, which has a 7-core variant where the 8th core is disabled. According to Apple, the 8-core GPU can execute 25,000 threads simultaneously. It's capable of 2.6 teraflops of throughput. This is pretty comparable to the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 2080 Super. The Neural Engine is a 16-core design capable of executing 11 trillion operations per second. Wrap your head around that. There are 16 billion transistors all on this tiny little chip. I can barely wrap my head around a billion anything, much less 11 trillion. Battery life, up to 18 to 20 hours according to Apple. This SoC is so energy efficient, M1 equipped MacBooks are getting up to 20 hours of battery life. True all-day battery life without having to worry about recharging. Linus at Linus Tech Tips actually did a test, and the M1 equipped 13-inch MacBook Pro indeed lasted just over 20 hours before it said, I've had enough. The Image Signal Processor, or ISP, according to Apple, offers higher quality video with better noise reduction, greater dynamic range, and improved auto white balance. And white balance is key. It's critical to true accurate video imaging. The storage controller. Also, according to Apple, the storage controller is a high-performance storage controller with AES encryption hardware for faster and more secure SSD performance. Media encode and decode. Low-power, high-efficient media encode and decode engines for great performance and extended battery life. The secure enclave, Apple calls it best-in-class security. Now let's deep dive into why M1 is so incredibly fast. It starts with Apple's Unified Memory Architecture, or UMA. The UMA on the M1 allows the CPU, GPU, and other processor components to access the same data pool without the need for components to copy data between one another. Let me say that again. This allows all components of the M1 to access all data without having to copy data between the components. This is one of the things that makes M1 so incredibly fast. According to Erik Engheim in his brilliant article at debugger.medium.com, link below in the description, and I highly recommend you checking his article out. The big problem with most home computer systems, including x86 architecture, is they are slow, big time slow, and hot. They use a lot of energy. One of the main reasons for their relative snail's pace processing is the fact that they have historically had the CPU and GPU integrated into the same chip. The phrase integrated graphics has been infamously synonymous with slow graphics. But why is this configuration so slow? The M1 blazes and it's configured on the same chip. The answer lies in the way the memory is configured on x86 chips. Remember, the M1 is unified memory in which all components of the processor can access data without the need for copying. On all other integrated chips, the memory for the CPU and the memory for the GPU are separate, and worse yet, they cannot access each other. If the CPU has a chunk of data that the GPU needs to use, the CPU can't just let the GPU borrow some of that memory. The CPU has to copy the whole chunk of data over to the memory area controlled by the GPU, bogging down the entire system in a memory quagmire. The end result is the GPU just sitting around waiting on massive chunks of data while the CPU is only capable of providing tiny bits of data to a greedy GPU that wants to gorge on a data buffet. Think of it like this. The GPU orders a whole bunch of packages, memory from the CPU, but the CPU is only capable of shipping a few small packages at a time. The GPU is just sitting around waiting and waiting for packages that only a few at a time are sent, when what's really needed is truckloads of packages for the GPU. Or think of it another way. While these GPUs have great performance, they want to drink an Olympic-sized swimming pool of water, but only have a straw to do it. No matter how great the GPU is, they can't get the data fast enough because the throughput is woefully inadequate. Another huge problem with this configuration is heat. These systems run hot. The GPU tries to chew through so much massive amounts of data. This generates massive amounts of heat. That's why these GPUs need multiple huge fans. Apple's UMA solves this problem. There's no memory for just the CPU or just the GPU separately. They can use the same memory. No copying needed. Apple uses memory that delivers large chunks of data, and it delivers it fast. And I mean really fast. Apple has significantly reduced the power consumption on the GPU, so Apple can incorporate a pretty powerful GPU on the SoC without it overheating. And finally, the coup de grace feature of the M1. The M1 not only has an industry-leading, but an industry unheard of 8 decoders. The biggest and baddest Intel and AMD microprocessors have 4. This is one of the key differences between CISC and RISC architectures, and part of the magic of RISC and why RISC is the future of processor architecture. It's why Intel and AMD are seriously snookered way behind the 8-ball right now. Why, Richard, you might ask? Well, let me explain. x86 instructions can be anywhere from 1 to 15 bytes long. Every single ARM instruction is 4 bytes. Why is this important? Because for ARM, splitting streams of bytes into instructions is much simpler if every instruction has the same length. With x86, the decoders have no idea where the next instruction starts, so x86 has to try to decode at every possible point. This is fraught with mistakes and results in a tangled web of incorrect guesses, and a complex decoder stage that makes it nearly impossible to add more decoders. AMD even states that, at this point, 4 decoders is its upper limit. For Apple, 8 is child's play, and they can probably easily add more. Well, this has been a deep dive into the M1 and its industry game-changing, sheer brilliant computing capabilities. Now, instead of Apple having to wait for the hardware to try to catch up to the software, as it did with Intel, developers can now start pushing the limits of their software. Hardware will no longer be the rate-limiting step for neither Apple nor developers. The only limit now is their imaginations. I can't wait for the next generation of Apple Silicon. I'm Richard. This is iTalk. Smash that like button and subscribe, and share, and hit that bell notification so you don't miss an iTalk video. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you on the flip side. We are out. M1 Deep Dive Camera 3, take 1. This is the real one. Maybe. The P cluster has 192 kilobytes. The P cluster has 192. This is hard to. This is a tongue twister.
Yeah.
Battery life. The battery life. I just have to read.
That's it. Just gotta read it.
God, that was painful. I don't know why that was so hard.